somewhere inside you, there is a version of yourself you have never fully met. A version that is sharper, stronger, more focused, more alive. A version that does not flinch at hard decisions, does not shrink in difficult moments, and does not spend Sunday nights with that slow, quiet ache of knowing you are capable of far more than what you are currently living. You have felt that version, maybe in brief flashes, maybe in moments of clarity that came and went before you could hold on to them. And then life pulled you back. Back to the routine. Back to the noise. Back to the comfortable smallness that most people have silently agreed to call a life. This audiobook is about that gap. The gap between who you are right now and who you are truly capable of becoming. And more importantly, it is about why that gap exists, why it persists, and exactly what it takes to close it permanently. Here is the truth that nobody wants to say out loud. Most people will never reach their full potential. Not because they lack talent, not because they were born without the right gifts or the right circumstances. Most people will never reach their full potential because they never truly decide to. They drift, they hope, they wait. They tell themselves the story that one day, when things calm down, when they have more time, when they feel more ready, they will finally become the person they know they could be. But that day never comes. And year after year, the distance between who they are and who they could have been grows wider, until eventually they stop measuring it altogether. That is the quiet tragedy of an unlived potential. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with warning signs or flashing lights. It happens gradually, invisibly, in the accumulation of small compromises and comfortable choices, until one day you look up and realize that the boldest version of yourself has been waiting at a door you never opened. But here is what makes this audiobook different from everything else you have heard on this topic. This is not about motivation. Motivation is temporary. You can feel motivated today and completely hollow tomorrow. This audiobook is about something far more durable. It is about understanding exactly why the gap between potential and reality exists, what forces maintain it, what psychological traps keep even intelligent, hard-working people stuck for years, and what specific shifts in thinking, identity, environment, and action will close that gap in a way that lasts. By the time you finish this, you will not just feel inspired. You will see your life differently. You will see yourself differently. And you will have a clear, actionable understanding of what needs to change and precisely how to change it. This is not passive listening. Every word in this audiobook is designed to move you. So commit to it fully. Because the person on the other side of this is the one you have always known you could be. Chapter 1. The Potential Paradox. Ask almost any person on the planet whether they believe they are capable of more than what they are currently achieving. And the overwhelming majority will say yes, they believe it. Deep down, they feel it. There is something in the human spirit that carries an innate sense that it has not yet reached its ceiling, that there is more to give, more to become, more to experience. And yet, despite this near-universal belief in their own untapped capacity, most of those same people will go back to doing exactly what they were doing before you asked the question. They will return to the same habits, the same patterns, the same level of effort, the same quality of thinking, and nothing will change. This is the potential paradox. The gap between believing you are capable of more and actually becoming more is not a gap of talent or intelligence or even opportunity. It is a gap of translation. The belief exists. The capability exists. But something in between the knowing and the doing breaks down, again and again, across millions of people, across decades of their lives. Understanding why this paradox exists is the first and most important step in escaping it. The human mind is extraordinary at imagining potential futures. You can picture yourself healthy, disciplined, successful, deeply skilled at something meaningful. You can construct a vivid internal image of the person you want to become. And for a moment, that image feels real enough to motivate action. You sign up for the course. You start the morning routine. You make the commitment. But then, almost inevitably, that image begins to fade. The vividness of the vision dims. The friction of reality rises. And slowly, incrementally, you return to your baseline. Not because you stopped caring, not because the vision was wrong, but because picturing a future self is not the same as becoming that self. Psychologists have studied this phenomenon extensively. When people visualize success without also mentally rehearsing the obstacles and difficulties that stand between them and that success, the act of visualization itself can actually reduce motivation. The brain, in a sense, partially experiences the imagined future as already real. The emotional reward of the vision is felt without the corresponding effort being made. This is why daydreaming about your goals can feel productive while actually draining the drive to pursue them. You imagined crossing the finish line without running the race. But there is something deeper at play beyond the mechanics of visualization. The potential paradox is also rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of what potential actually is. Most people treat potential as a fixed quantity, something they either have or do not have, something waiting to be discovered rather than built. They ask themselves, "What am I capable of?" as if the answer is already written somewhere inside them, hidden and waiting. But potential is not a static reservoir. It is a dynamic process. It grows in response to challenge, shrinks in response to comfort, and is constantly being shaped by the choices you make and the environments you inhabit. This means that your potential today is not the ceiling of your potential tomorrow. The capacity you have right now is not the limit of what you can develop. But it also means that potential is not self-activating. It does not grow simply because time passes or because you believe in it. It grows only when it is deliberately exercised, stretched, and challenged. And this is the part that most people skip. They believe in their potential, but they do not train it. They admire it from a distance rather than testing it under pressure. There is also a social dimension to the potential paradox that rarely gets discussed. We live in a world that is extraordinarily good at keeping people comfortable. Modern life has constructed an elaborate system of entertainment, distraction, and convenience that makes it easier than at any point in human history to exist without ever confronting your own potential. You can fill every waking hour with passive consumption. You can be constantly stimulated without ever being genuinely challenged. And the brutal irony is that none of this feels like failure. It feels like living. It looks like a full life from the outside. But on the inside, there is often a quiet awareness that something essential is missing, that the life being lived is less than what was possible. The paradox, then, is not that people do not want to reach their potential. They do. It is that the very comfort and ease of modern existence makes not reaching it the path of least resistance. And the human brain, by its very design, is wired to take the path of least resistance whenever possible. Breaking out of the potential paradox requires understanding this clearly. It is not about wanting it more. Most people already want it enough. It is about understanding the specific forces that work against you and building a life structure that systematically removes those forces and replaces them with conditions that make growth not just possible but inevitable. That is exactly what this audiobook is going to give you. Chapter 2. The Comfort Trap. There is nothing wrong with comfort. Let us be clear about that from the beginning. Wanting a stable life, wanting peace, wanting ease is not weakness. It is human. But there is a version of comfort that quietly destroys potential. A version so subtle, so normalized, so deeply woven into daily life that most people never even recognize it as a threat. And that version is not comfort as rest. It is comfort as identity. It is the moment when comfort stops being something you choose and starts being something you need. The comfort trap does not announce itself with dramatic urgency. It does not arrive as a crisis you are forced to address. It arrives slowly, pleasantly, disguised as reward. It arrives after a hard week, when you tell yourself you have earned the right to coast. It arrives in the form of a routine that used to stretch you, but no longer does. It arrives when you stop applying for the bigger role because the current one is fine. When you stop having the difficult conversation because the relationship is comfortable enough. When you stop pushing the creative work because what you have already done is good enough to be accepted. Fine. Enough. These are the words of the comfort trap, and they are extraordinarily dangerous because they feel like contentment while functioning as stagnation. Here is what neuroscience tells us about comfort and the brain. The human nervous system is built around a principle called homeostasis, the drive to maintain equilibrium, to return to a known and stable state. When you step outside your comfort zone, your brain registers it as a potential threat and activates stress responses designed to bring you back to baseline. Heart rate increases, anxiety rises, self-doubt amplifies, and the brain sends powerful signals urging you to retreat, to return to what is known, to restore the comfortable equilibrium. This response evolved over millions of years to keep our ancestors alive in a dangerous world. But in the modern context, where the most important growth happens, not in physical safety but in psychological and professional challenge, this ancient wiring works against you. It interprets growth as danger and safety as survival, even when the reverse is closer to the truth. This is why stepping outside your comfort zone always feels harder than staying inside it, even when the logical, rational part of your mind knows that growth lies on the other side. The discomfort is real. The resistance is genuine. But it is not a signal to stop. It is a signal that you are approaching the edge where real development happens. The comfort trap becomes most dangerous when people confuse the absence of discomfort with the presence of growth. They feel fine, so they assume they are progressing. But feeling fine and growing are not the same thing. In fact, in many cases, they are opposites. Real growth almost always involves periods of frustration, confusion, awkward incompetence, and emotional discomfort. It involves doing things before you feel ready, saying things before you feel confident enough, attempting things before you know for certain you will succeed. The comfort trap is the belief that you should wait until it feels right, until you feel ready, until you feel prepared enough to leap. But that moment of perfect readiness almost never arrives naturally. It is manufactured by the act of leaping itself. There is another layer to the comfort trap that operates at the level of identity rather than behavior. Over time, the choices you repeatedly make become the story you tell yourself about who you are. If you consistently choose comfort over challenge, you begin to internalize a self-image of someone who plays it safe, someone who is not the type to take big risks, someone who is not built for the kind of radical transformation they once believed was possible. And once that identity becomes fixed, it stops feeling like a choice. It starts feeling like a fact, and you stop questioning it altogether. This is why so many people who are privately dissatisfied with their level of achievement externally project confidence and satisfaction. They have made peace with the gap between their potential and their reality by redefining the gap as normal, as inevitable, as simply the way life is. The comfort trap does not just limit your behavior, it rewrites your ambitions to fit your limitations, so that eventually you no longer feel the tension of the gap at all. Escaping the comfort trap begins with something deceptively simple. It begins with deliberately choosing discomfort on a small but consistent basis. Not dramatic, life-altering risk every single day, but the practice of doing one thing each day that your comfort-seeking brain would rather you avoid. A difficult conversation, a creative attempt, a physical challenge, a professional risk, a moment of vulnerability. The consistent practice of choosing challenge over comfort, even in small doses, begins to reprogram the nervous system's relationship with discomfort. It teaches the brain that stepping outside the known zone is survivable, that the discomfort on the other side of a challenge is not a threat but a signal of growth. And over time, this practice begins to shift your identity from someone who needs comfort to someone who is built for challenge. That is the beginning of the escape. But to fully understand what is keeping you trapped, we need to go deeper, because the comfort trap is only one of several forces working against your potential, and some of the others are far less visible and far more insidious. Chapter 3. The 7 Silent Killers of Potential. If you ask most people why they have not reached their potential, they would give you a surface-level answer. Not enough time, not enough money, not the right connections, not the right moment. These answers are not entirely false, but they are almost entirely beside the point. Because the real obstacles to human potential are not external. They are internal. They are psychological. They are invisible. They operate beneath the level of conscious awareness, shaping behavior, limiting thinking, and quietly dismantling the possibilities of an entire lifetime without the person ever realizing what is happening. These are the 7 silent killers of potential, and understanding them is the first step to defeating them. The first is fear of identity loss. This is perhaps the least talked about and most powerful obstacle of all. Change. Real change. The kind of change that closes the gap between who you are and who you could be, does not just require you to behave differently. It requires you to become a different person. And becoming a different person means losing something of who you currently are. The people who fear this unconsciously cling to their current identity, even when that identity is limiting them, because the known self, no matter how unsatisfying, feels safer than the unknown self that would emerge on the other side of transformation. They call themselves not a morning person, when what they mean is they have not yet decided to become one. They call themselves bad at numbers, bad at public speaking, not creative, not disciplined, as if these are fixed truths about their nature rather than descriptions of their current habits. The label becomes a wall, and they defend that wall without realizing it is a prison of their own construction. The second silent killer is comparison paralysis. The digital age has made this one uniquely destructive. When you constantly measure your progress against the highlight reels of others, you distort your own sense of where you are and what you are capable of. Comparison does two specific kinds of damage. First, it makes your starting point feel so far behind that beginning seems almost pointless. Why start when you can see how far ahead everyone else already is? Second, and more subtly, it shifts your definition of success from your personal best to a standard defined by others. When your target is external rather than internal, you lose the deeply personal motivation that makes sustained effort possible. You are no longer running your own race. You are chasing someone else's finish line. And that chase will exhaust you long before it fulfills you. The third silent killer is the approval trap. The need for external validation is a deeply human impulse. We are social creatures, and the desire to be seen, accepted, and admired by the people around us is hardwired into our psychology. But when the need for approval becomes the primary driver of decisions, it becomes a cage, because other people's approval is almost never aligned with the requirements of your fullest potential. The people who love you most will often unconsciously try to keep you close to who you currently are, because growth changes relationships, and change, even positive change, can feel threatening to those who are not changing alongside you. When you build your life around what others will think, you surrender your potential to the average of those around you. And the average is, by definition, ordinary. The fourth silent killer is the perfectionism delay. Perfectionism is rarely about high standards. It is almost always about fear. The fear of being judged inadequate. The fear of producing something imperfect that reveals a gap between your aspirations and your abilities. And so the perfectionist delays. They wait until the plan is airtight, until the timing is perfect, until the skill is fully developed. But perfect preparation is a myth that keeps action perpetually on the horizon. The truth is that the development of any meaningful capability requires the production of imperfect work. It requires the awkward first attempts, the clumsy early drafts, the rough and unpolished versions of something that will eventually become excellent. Perfectionists deprive themselves of this essential learning process by refusing to begin before conditions are ideal. And ideal conditions almost never arrive. The fifth silent killer is environment misalignment. Your environment is not neutral. The physical spaces you inhabit, the people you spend time with, the information you consistently consume, the culture of the organizations you belong to, all of these exert a constant and powerful influence on your behavior, your thinking, and your beliefs about what is possible for someone like you. When your environment is misaligned with your potential, It acts as a constant drag on your progress. You can want to grow with your entire conscious mind, but if every element of your daily environment is reinforcing the behaviors and beliefs of your old self, the environment will almost always win. This is not weakness. It is neuroscience. The brain is profoundly shaped by context, and a context designed for comfort will consistently produce comfort-seeking behavior, regardless of what the conscious mind desires. The sixth silent killer is the waiting mindset. This is the belief that the right conditions for action lie somewhere in the future, when things settle down, when I have more resources, when I feel more confident, when the time is right. The waiting mindset is seductive because it feels responsible. It feels like prudence. It feels like the wise choice to prepare thoroughly before committing. But waiting is almost never about preparation. It is almost always about fear wearing the costume of patience. The people who consistently reach their potential are not people who waited until they were ready. They are people who began before they were ready and became ready in the process of beginning. Readiness is not a precondition for action. It is a consequence of it. The seventh silent killer is shrinking to fit. This is what happens when, over time, a person unconsciously reduces the scale of their ambitions to match the scale of what feels achievable given their current circumstances. They do not make a dramatic decision to aim lower. They make a series of small, almost imperceptible adjustments, each one moving the target a little closer, a little smaller, a little safer, until eventually the goal they are pursuing bears almost no resemblance to the vision they once held for their life. And because this process happens gradually, they rarely notice it. They simply find, one day, that they are no longer excited by what they are working toward, that the thing they are building no longer feels connected to the person they once intended to become, and they cannot quite identify when or why that changed. These seven forces do not operate in isolation. They reinforce each other, compound each other, and create a web of resistance that keeps millions of people stuck at a fraction of their actual capability. Recognizing them, naming them, seeing them clearly in your own life is the beginning of defeating them, because you cannot change what you cannot see, and now you see them. Chapter 4. The lies you were told. Before you were old enough to think critically about the world was already thinking for you. Parents, teachers, communities, institutions, every force that shaped your earliest years was encoding beliefs into you. Beliefs about what is possible, what is appropriate, what people like you do and do not achieve. Most of this happened without malice. Most of it was well-intentioned. But good intentions do not make a belief true, and many of the deepest convictions you carry about your own potential were given to you by people who were themselves operating under the same inherited limitations, which means the ceiling you are bumping up against may not be yours. It may be theirs, passed down quietly, invisibly, across generations of people who never thought to question it. This chapter is about the lies, not the obvious ones, not the cruel or deliberately limiting messages, but the subtle, normalized, culturally embedded narratives about potential, success, and what a good life looks like, that have been quietly constraining your thinking without your conscious awareness. The first lie is that talent is something you have. not something you build. From the very beginning of education, the system sorts people into categories: the talented and the average, the gifted and the ordinary, the ones who have it and the ones who do not. This sorting happens early, and it happens with authority. And once a child receives the label of not particularly talented in a given domain, they internalize it as truth. They stop practicing with the same intensity. They stop believing that effort will eventually transform into excellence. They accept the label as a verdict, rather than recognizing it as simply a description of their current stage of development. But decades of research in the psychology of expertise tell a radically different story. Talent, as we commonly understand it, accounts for far less of exceptional performance than we have been led to believe. What separates the most accomplished people in almost any domain from those who plateau is not an innate gift. It is the quality and quantity of deliberate practice over extended periods of time. People who were told they had no talent for mathematics, for music, for writing, for leadership, for business, have gone on to achieve extraordinary things in those exact domains because they refused to accept the label and committed to the long process of building capability through consistent effort. The lie of fixed talent has cost the world incalculable potential, and it may be costing you yours right now. The second lie is that success requires exceptional circumstances, that the people who achieve remarkable things had remarkable advantages: the right family, the right school, the right network, the right moment. And there is a grain of truth here that makes this lie particularly convincing. Circumstances do matter. Privilege is real. Access is unequal. But the implicit conclusion that most people draw from this truth, which is that without those advantages, extraordinary achievement is essentially out of reach, is both factually wrong and psychologically catastrophic. Because the moment you externalize the primary cause of your potential to circumstances outside your control, you surrender your agency. You become a passenger in your own life, waiting for conditions to improve, rather than taking action with the conditions that exist right now. History is filled with people who achieved remarkable things from genuinely difficult starting positions. Not because difficulty is romantic or because struggle is necessary for success, but because the people who refuse to wait for perfect circumstances are the same people who develop the extraordinary resourcefulness, resilience, and creativity that difficult circumstances demand. The circumstances are real. The limitations are real. But they are not the final word on what is possible for you. The third lie is that the goal of life is stability, security, the steady job, the paid mortgage, the safe and predictable path. These things are not bad, but they were never designed to lead you toward the fullest expression of your potential. They were designed to produce reliable, predictable, manageable people. People who fit well into systems. People who do not disrupt or deviate. And for a long time, that was an entirely reasonable bargain. Stability in exchange for predictability. But the world has changed. The economy has changed. The nature of work has changed. And the idea that the safest path is the one that avoids risk has become, paradoxically, one of the most dangerous beliefs a person can hold. Because, in a world that changes as fast as this one, stability achieved through rigidity is fragile. And the safest thing you can do for your long-term security is to relentlessly develop the skills, the adaptability, and the self-knowledge that make you capable in any environment. The fourth lie is the most personal and the most damaging. And it is this, that someone like you does not reach that kind of level. This lie arrives not in explicit words, but in the absence of examples. In the people you grew up around who never achieved great things, not because they were incapable, but because they never truly believed they could. In the unspoken cultural norms of the community that defined what was realistic for someone of your background, your gender, your socio-economic starting point. In the subtle messages received across a childhood and an adolescence about where people like you belong in the hierarchy of achievement. These messages do not tell you that you cannot. They simply never show you that you can. And the absence of that example, that proof of possibility, creates a silent ceiling that operates below the level of conscious thought. Dismantling these lies is not a matter of positive thinking. It is a matter of deliberate investigation, of going back through the beliefs you hold about your own potential and asking, with genuine curiosity and courage, where did this come from? Is this actually true? Or is this simply a story I was handed by someone who was themselves limited, afraid, or unaware of what I am capable of? Because here is what is absolutely certain. You are not the inherited limitations of those who came before you. You are not the verdict of an educational system that was never designed to reveal your full capability. You are not defined by the environments that shaped you or the circumstances you were born into. You are a dynamic, developing, continuously evolving human being whose potential is not fixed and whose future is not written. But claiming that future requires first recognizing the stories that have been quietly capping it. Chapter 5. The fear of becoming. Of all the forces that prevent people from reaching their potential, this one is the strangest, the least expected, and in many ways the most powerful. It is not the fear of failure. Everyone understands the fear of failure. It is the fear of success, the fear of becoming, the deep, irrational, rarely acknowledged terror of what it would actually mean to step into the fullest version of yourself. And this fear is real, more real than most people will ever admit, even to themselves. Here is why it exists. Becoming the fullest version of yourself is not just a pleasant upgrade. It is a transformation, and transformations require loss. When you grow beyond your current level, you grow beyond your current relationships, your current social group, your current identity. The version of you that exists right now has a set of relationships built on a certain equilibrium. People know what to expect from you. They have calibrated their expectations, their affections, their dynamics with you based on who you currently are. When you change significantly, that equilibrium is disrupted. And some of those relationships, the ones that were built on your remaining small, familiar, unthreatening, will struggle to survive the change. This is not theory. It is one of the most commonly reported experiences among people who have made dramatic leaps in their development. The relationships that held together in one season of life do not always survive the transition to the next. And on some level, many people know this unconsciously. They feel that if they grow too much, they will lose connection to the people and places they love. And so they hold back. Not because they are afraid of what lies ahead, but because they are afraid of leaving behind what they currently have. There is also the fear of the heightened standard. When you operate at a higher level, You are held to a higher standard, both by others and by yourself. The expectations increase. The visibility increases. The stakes of failure increase. Right now, you can fail quietly. You can experiment without much consequence. You can fall short without it mattering much to anyone. But the version of you who has stepped fully into your potential operates in a different arena. One where the failures are more public, the criticism is sharper, and the gap between where you are and where you are expected to be is more scrutinized. The fear of that exposure, of being seen and judged at a higher level, keeps many people safely hidden at a lower one. Then there is the fear of running out of excuses. This is the one that nobody ever says out loud, but that silently controls the behavior of enormous numbers of people right now. If you have not reached your potential, you have reasons, valid, genuine, compelling reasons. The timing was not right. The resources were not there. The circumstances were difficult. The support was insufficient. These reasons may all be true, but they are also serving a hidden function. They are protecting you from having to test the absolute limit of what you are capable of. Because as long as external conditions are less than ideal, you can always tell yourself that you would have done more, achieved more, become more, if only the conditions had been better. But the moment you remove those conditions, the moment the resources are available, the timing is right, the support is in place, you are left with a terrifying question. With everything I need, will I be enough? And that question, more than any external obstacle, is what many people are truly running from. Understanding the fear of becoming does not make it disappear, but it does change your relationship to it. Because when you can name it accurately, when you can see it clearly rather than experiencing it as vague anxiety or inexplicable self-sabotage, you can make a conscious choice about it. You can acknowledge the fear and move forward anyway. You can say, yes, this will change things. Yes, some relationships may shift. Yes, the standards will be higher. Yes, there will be nowhere left to hide. And then you can decide that all of that is worth it for the life that waits on the other side. Because the fear of becoming is ultimately the fear of a larger, bolder, more demanding, more exposed, more alive version of yourself. And while that version is more vulnerable, it is also more real, more true, more aligned with what you actually came here to be. The shrinking version of you might be safer, but only the full version of you is genuinely free. Growth will cost you something. It always does. The question is not whether you are willing to pay a price. The question is which price. The price of growth, which is temporary discomfort, disruption, and uncertainty on the way to something better, or the price of remaining the same, which is permanent disconnection from the life you know you are capable of living. Both choices come with a cost, but only one of them comes with a life that was worth the cost. Chapter 6. The Identity Shift. Everything you have read so far has been pointing toward a single, central truth. And that truth is this: you will never consistently behave in ways that contradict who you believe yourself to be. Read that again. You will never consistently behave in ways that contradict who you believe yourself to be. This is the fundamental law of human behavior that most self-improvement advice completely ignores. Most advice operates at the level of behavior. Do this, Stop doing that. Build this habit. Break that pattern. And for a short time, willpower can force compliance with those instructions. But without a corresponding shift in identity, behavior change is always temporary. The old self eventually reasserts itself. The diet ends. The discipline fades. The momentum collapses. And people blame their lack of willpower without ever understanding that willpower was never the real issue. The real issue is identity. And until identity changes, nothing changes permanently. Here is what identity actually means in this context. Your identity is the collection of beliefs you hold about who you are. It is the story you tell yourself, consciously and unconsciously, about what kind of person you are, what you are capable of, what you deserve, how you typically behave under pressure, and what is realistic for someone like you. These beliefs are not abstract. They are operational. They directly determine what actions feel natural and what actions feel forced. They determine what you reach for automatically and what you resist instinctively. They determine the ceiling of your consistent behavior far more powerfully than your goals, your plans, or your intentions ever could. When someone says they are just not a disciplined person, they are not making a neutral observation. They are making a declaration of identity. And every time they act in accordance with that declaration, skipping the workout, abandoning the plan, choosing comfort over commitment, they are casting a vote that reinforces the identity. And the more votes that accumulate, the more solid and immovable that identity becomes, until it stops feeling like a belief and starts feeling like a fact of nature. This is why people who have tried and failed at behavior change multiple times often feel a kind of learned helplessness about it. They have not failed because they lack the capacity to change. They have failed because they attempted to change behavior without first changing the identity from which the behavior naturally flows. They tried to act like a disciplined person while still fundamentally seeing themselves as someone who is not disciplined. And the identity always wins. So how does identity actually shift? The answer is both simpler and more demanding than most people expect. Identity shifts through evidence. Specifically through the accumulation of small, consistent pieces of evidence that the new identity is real. Every time you do the thing the new version of you would do, every time you honor the commitment the person you are becoming would honor, you cast a vote for that new identity. One vote does not change an election, but thousands of votes, cast consistently over time, begin to shift the fundamental story of who you are. This means the starting point of genuine transformation is not a dramatic behavioral overhaul. It is a decision about who you are choosing to become, not who you hope to become, not who you plan to become someday. Who you are becoming right now, today, with the very next action you take. The person who is becoming disciplined does not wait until they feel disciplined. They take the disciplined action and use that action as evidence that they are, in fact, a disciplined person. The person who is becoming courageous does not wait until fear disappears. They act in the presence of fear and use that act as proof of their courage. The identity is claimed first, in the mind, and then confirmed repeatedly through behavior. There is a crucial distinction between outcome-based identity and process-based identity that is worth understanding clearly. Outcome-based identity says, I will believe I am a writer when I have published a book. I will believe I am an athlete when I have run a marathon. I will believe I am successful when I have reached a certain income level. This version of identity is always deferred, always conditional, always waiting for external validation before it will allow the internal shift. And because the identity never fully arrives, the consistent behavior that would produce the outcome never fully arrives either. Process-based identity says, I am a writer because I write. I am an athlete because I train. I am building something significant because I show up and do the work every day. This version does not wait for the outcome to confirm the identity. It claims the identity in the process itself. And paradoxically, this is the version that actually produces the outcomes. Because when the identity is owned in the present, the behavior that flows from it becomes natural rather than forced. The identity shift is not a moment, it is a practice. It is the ongoing, daily, sometimes difficult practice of choosing to see yourself as the person you are becoming rather than as the person you have historically been. It requires catching yourself when you default to the old story and deliberately choosing a different one. It requires defending your new identity against the skepticism of people who knew you before and the internal resistance of a brain that defaults to what is familiar. It requires patience, because identity is built in the aggregate, not in a single act of will. But here is what is absolutely certain. When the identity shifts, everything else follows. The habits become easier because they are consistent with who you are. The discipline becomes more natural because it expresses rather than contradicts your self-concept. The resilience deepens because you are no longer fighting your own identity every time you face a challenge. You are simply being who you have decided to be. And that is a completely different experience from the exhausting, willpower-dependent grind of trying to force behavior that your identity is actively resisting. Decide who you are becoming. Own that identity now, and then cast every vote you can for it, one action at a time. Chapter 7. The Power of Environment. You are not who you think you are in isolation. You are who you are in context. And context, the physical environment you inhabit, the information you habitually consume, the culture of the spaces you spend time in, shapes your behavior, your thinking, and your beliefs about what is possible with a force that most people dramatically underestimate. We like to believe that we are the sole authors of our choices, that our decisions arise from our values and our willpower independent of what surrounds us. But the evidence tells a different and more humbling story. The environment is not neutral. It is actively and continuously shaping you, either toward your potential or away from it, whether you are aware of it or not. Consider the most basic level of how environment influences behavior. Research in behavioral economics and psychology has demonstrated repeatedly that the default option in any environment, the path of least resistance, is the one that the vast majority of people will take, regardless of their intentions, regardless of their stated preferences, and regardless of what they would choose if they stopped to think carefully. People eat what is easily accessible. They do what is socially normal in their immediate community. They think in ways that are consistent with the dominant narratives of their environment. They aspire to levels of achievement that match the visible ceiling of their social and physical context, not because they have consciously chosen these behaviors, but because the environment makes these behaviors automatic and everything else effortful. This has a profound implication. If your environment is not deliberately designed for growth, it is almost certainly working against your growth by default. The convenience food is more accessible than the nutritious option. The entertainment is more immediately rewarding than the challenging creative work. The social norm of your community may be to celebrate comfort and mock ambition. The physical space you work in may be filled with distractions that your brain finds genuinely difficult to resist. And each of these environmental factors, individually, small, and seemingly trivial, collectively creates a powerful current that pulls you toward a version of yourself that is smaller than the one you are capable of becoming. The most effective people in the world understand something that most people never grasp. They understand that their primary job is not to exercise willpower in a difficult environment. It is to design an environment in which willpower is rarely needed. They make the behavior they want automatic by making it the default, the easiest option, the thing that happens when they are not actively thinking about it. They make the behavior they want to avoid difficult by removing it from easy reach, adding friction between themselves and the temptation, and restructuring their environment so that the path of least resistance leads toward their goals rather than away from them. This is environmental design, and it is one of the most powerful and underutilized tools for human development. Think about what your current environment is designed to produce. When you walk into your workspace, does it cue focus and deep work? Or does it cue distraction and passive consumption? When you open your phone, what is the first thing you see? Is it something that moves you toward your goals, or something that pulls you into a passive scroll that steals an hour before you realize what has happened? When you come home in the evening, what does your environment make easy? Rest and recovery? Or meaningful creative or intellectual work? Are the tools for the things you most want to do visible, accessible, and ready to use? Or are they buried under friction, inconvenience, and the competing attractions of easier, more immediately rewarding alternatives? Most people answer these questions and realize that their environment, which they largely inherited or assembled without deliberate intention, is not remotely aligned with the potential they say they want to reach. And then they wonder why reaching it requires such an exhausting, constant battle against their own impulses. The answer is that they are fighting the current of their environment with nothing but willpower. And willpower, as we have already established, is finite, unreliable, and perpetually outmatched by a well-designed environment. Changing your environment does not require dramatic upheaval. It begins with small, strategic adjustments to the defaults of your daily life. Put the book you want to read on your pillow. Put your workout clothes next to your bed. Remove the apps that steal your focus from your phone's home screen. Create a specific, dedicated space for the work that matters most. A space associated only with that work, so that the space itself becomes a cue for focus. Reduce the visibility and accessibility of the behaviors you want to reduce. Increase the visibility and accessibility of the behaviors you want to increase. These are not grand gestures, but they change the default. And changing the default changes behavior far more reliably than changing your level of motivation or willpower. Beyond the physical environment, there is also the informational environment to consider. The ideas you are most frequently exposed to become the boundaries of your thinking. The news you consume shapes your perception of what is possible and what is threatening. The content you engage with daily is quietly programming your beliefs about success, about human nature, about your own capabilities. If your informational environment is dominated by negativity, fear, limitation, and low ambition, those things will seep into your thinking regardless of your conscious intentions. And if it is filled with evidence of human potential, with examples of what disciplined effort and clear thinking can produce, those things will seep in instead. Your environment is a vote. Every element of it is either voting for the life you want or against it. And redesigning it deliberately and strategically is one of the highest leverage investments you can make in your own potential. Chapter 8. Who you surround yourself with. If environment is the stage on which your life plays out, then the people in your environment are the most powerful elements of all. Nothing shapes a human being more profoundly, more continuously, or more invisibly than the people they choose to be around. Not education, not books, not ambition, not even intelligence. The company you keep determines more about the trajectory of your life than almost any other single variable. And most people have never made a truly conscious, deliberate choice about it. We absorb the people around us without realizing it. Their habits become normalized. Their standards become your standards. Their beliefs about what is possible become the invisible ceiling of your own expectations. Their relationship with effort, with risk, with discipline, with ambition becomes the unconscious template against which you measure your own behavior. If the people closest to you have settled, there is an almost gravitational pull toward settling with them. Not because they are bad people or because they want to hold you back, but because human beings are profoundly social creatures who unconsciously calibrate their behavior to the norms of their group. Deviation from those norms creates social friction. And social friction is one of the most powerful deterrents to sustained behavior change that exists. This is why the classic observation that you become the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with is not just motivational rhetoric. It is a description of a documented psychological phenomenon. Social comparison, behavioral contagion, norm conformity. These are real and powerful forces. You will work as hard as the people around you work. You will take risks that are proportional to the risks your social environment celebrates. You will aim for the level of success that your immediate community considers achievable, not consciously, not by choice, but through the constant, automatic process of social calibration that governs human behavior in groups. The implication of this is both uncomfortable and liberating. Uncomfortable because it means that some of the relationships in your life, the ones built on comfort, familiarity, and a shared history of settling, may be actively contributing to the gap between who you are and who you could become, and liberating because it means that deliberately choosing to spend more time with people who operate at a higher level, people who are more disciplined, more ambitious, more creative, more honest about their own limitations and relentless about overcoming them, will change you, not through advice or instruction, simply through proximity, simply through the normalization of a different standard. This does not mean abandoning the people you love. It does not mean treating relationships as transactions or discarding anyone who is not performing at a level you admire. Human relationships are more complex and more sacred than that. But it does mean being honest with yourself about the cumulative effect of your social environment, about who is pulling you forward and who is, even with the best of intentions, anchoring you to a version of yourself that is less than what you are capable of. And it means actively seeking the people who challenge you, who see you more clearly than you see yourself, who hold you to a standard that makes you uncomfortable in the most productive way possible, who have already done or are currently doing something that represents the level of thinking, the quality of work, the depth of discipline that you aspire to. Because spending time with those people changes the reference point for what is normal. Suddenly, the things that seemed hard or exceptional in your previous social context seem ordinary, and the things that seemed ambitious seem merely reasonable. Mentorship, whether formal or informal, deserves particular attention here. One of the most consistently observed accelerators of human development is the presence of someone who is further along the path, someone who has already navigated the territory you are trying to cross and can show you where the hidden obstacles are, what matters and what does not, how to compress years of learning into months by avoiding the most costly mistakes. Access to that kind of guidance is one of the most asymmetric investments a person can make. The time and energy required to find and cultivate a mentoring relationship is modest compared to the acceleration it can provide in virtually every domain of meaningful development. But mentorship is not just about finding someone to give you answers. It is about gaining a living, breathing example of what is possible. Because the human brain responds to proof of possibility in a way that it simply cannot respond to abstract encouragement. When you see someone who came from circumstances similar to yours and achieved something you thought was out of reach, something shifts. The ceiling cracks. The impossible becomes merely difficult. And difficult, with the right effort and the right guidance, becomes achievable. There is also the question of accountability. Growth is hard. There are days when motivation is absent, when the resistance is overwhelming, when the easy option is screaming for your attention, and the disciplined choice requires everything you have. In those moments, the presence of another person, someone who knows what you are working toward and who you have committed to showing up for, is one of the most reliable forces for keeping you in motion. Not because you cannot do it alone, but because human beings are wired for social commitment in a way that makes them more reliable in the presence of witnesses. We keep promises to others more consistently than we keep promises to ourselves. And using that wiring deliberately by building relationships with people you are accountable to is not weakness. It is intelligence. Choose your social environment as deliberately as you choose any other element of your life, because in the long run, it will shape you more powerfully than almost anything else. Chapter 9. The Execution Blueprint. Understanding why you have not reached your potential is necessary, but it is not sufficient. At some point, the diagnosis has to give way to the prescription. The awareness has to convert into action. And the bridge between knowing and doing, between intention and result, between the person you are and the person you are becoming, is execution. Consistent, disciplined, strategic execution. Not occasional heroic effort. Not inspired bursts of productivity separated by long stretches of drift, but the kind of steady, structured, daily execution that compounds over time into extraordinary results. This chapter is about exactly how to do that. The first principle of effective execution is clarity. Specifically, clarity about the single most important thing you need to accomplish in any given period of time. Most people operate with a vague sense of their goals and a long, ambitious list of things they would like to do. And because everything on the list feels important, they spread their energy across all of it, making shallow progress in many directions and deep progress in none. The result is a life of perpetual busyness that produces far less than it could, because the energy available for meaningful work is fragmented before it can build momentum in any single direction. Clarity is not about knowing everything you want. It is about identifying, with ruthless precision, the one thing that matters most right now. The one outcome that, if achieved, would make the greatest number of other things easier or unnecessary. The one skill, the one project, the one relationship, the one area of development that deserves the majority of your focused attention in this season of your life. Once that is identified with genuine clarity, the job of execution becomes infinitely more manageable. Because instead of trying to move in 12 directions at once, you are moving in one direction with everything you have. The second principle is the non-negotiable. A non-negotiable is a daily commitment that exists outside the domain of decision-making. It is not something you decide whether to do each morning based on how you feel or what the day looks like. It is simply something you do. The way you eat breakfast, the way you brush your teeth. It is a behavior that has been elevated from a goal to an identity-level commitment. The most effective people in every domain of human achievement have non-negotiables, practices so deeply embedded into their daily structure that skipping them would feel like a violation of who they are, not merely a deviation from a plan. Identifying your non-negotiables requires asking a specific question. What is the one daily practice that, if performed consistently over the next 12 months, would create the most meaningful progress toward the life I am building? For some people, it is 2 hours of deep, uninterrupted creative or intellectual work at the start of each day. For others, it is a daily physical practice that maintains the energy, clarity, and resilience that everything else depends on. For others, it is a daily review of their most important priorities, a few minutes of deliberate reflection that keeps the compass pointed in the right direction before the noise of the day arrives. Whatever it is for you, the key is to make it non-negotiable, not optional, not conditional on motivation or available time. Simply something you do every single day because you are the kind of person who does it. The third principle of effective execution is time architecture. You cannot manage time, but you can architect it. You can structure your days so that your most important work happens during your peak performance window, the hours when your cognitive capacity, your creativity, and your focus are at their highest. For most people, this is in the earlier part of the day, before the accumulated decisions, interruptions, and demands of daily life have drained the mental resources required for meaningful work. Using those peak hours for shallow tasks, for administrative work, for responding to other people's urgencies, is one of the most expensive mistakes a high-potential person can make. It is the equivalent of burning premium fuel on an engine that does not require it while leaving the engine that does on empty. Protect your peak hours. Guard them with intention and without apology. Do your most important work during them. Everything else can wait or be delegated or be eliminated entirely, and structure the rest of your day around recovery and renewal, so that tomorrow's peak hours begin from a place of genuine capacity rather than cumulative depletion. The fourth principle is the elimination of optionality. One of the most underappreciated sources of lost productivity and lost potential is the energy that goes into making decisions that should have already been made. Every morning that you have to decide whether to exercise, you are expending cognitive resources on a question that should have been answered once and permanently. Every day that you have to decide which project to work on first, you are fragmenting the focus that should be going into the work itself. The most effective executors reduce the number of live decisions in their daily life to the absolute minimum. They make commitments in advance. They establish routines that run on autopilot. They create systems that produce the right behavior without requiring willpower each time. This is not rigidity. It is intelligence. It is the recognition that cognitive resources are finite, that decision fatigue is real, and that the best use of a high-performing mind is not deciding what to do next, but actually doing the thing that has already been decided. Create the structure once, then live inside it and let it carry you forward. The fifth principle is the ruthless management of energy. Time and energy are not the same resource, and treating them as if they are is one of the most common errors in execution. You can have the time to do something and completely lack the energy to do it well. And work done without adequate energy is almost always worse than work not done at all. It requires revision, produces errors, and fails to leverage the full capability of the mind that produced it. Managing energy means taking sleep seriously as a performance variable, not a luxury. It means physical movement, not as a health obligation, but as a cognitive tool. It means managing the inputs that either deplete or restore your capacity. The conversations you have, the information you consume, the emotional weight you carry, and making deliberate choices about all of them. The sixth principle is measurement. What gets measured gets managed. More than that, what gets measured gets seen, and what gets seen can be responded to. Without measurement, execution becomes a feeling, a vague sense of whether things are going well or not. And feelings are notoriously unreliable guides to actual progress. Identify the specific metrics that tell the true story of your progress toward the thing that matters most. Track them simply and consistently. Review them regularly, and use them not as a source of self-judgment, but as information. Data about what is working, what is not, and where adjustment is needed. The goal of measurement is not to create pressure, it is to create clarity. And clarity is the foundation on which great execution is built. Put these principles together. Genuine clarity about what matters most. Non-negotiable daily commitments. Thoughtfully architected time. Reduced optionality through advanced decisions. Disciplined energy management. And honest measurement of progress. And you have a framework for execution that does not depend on motivation. That does not require you to feel ready or inspired or perfectly disciplined. That simply works day after day, regardless of how you feel, because it has been built into the structure of your life rather than left to the mercy of your mood. This is the blueprint. The question now is whether you will build with it. Chapter 10. The Daily Standard. There is a version of your day that, if lived consistently, would take you to the highest expression of your potential. And there is a version of your day that, if lived consistently, would keep you exactly where you are. In most cases, these two versions do not look dramatically different from the outside. The difference is not visible in the big, dramatic moments. It is hidden in the small, repeated, seemingly inconsequential choices that accumulate across hours and days and years into either a life of extraordinary achievement or a life of quiet, persistent regret. The daily standard is the internal benchmark you hold yourself to every single day. Not the standard that is visible to others, not the standard that earns you praise or recognition, the standard that only you know about. The one you set for yourself in the early morning before anyone is watching. The one you either uphold or quietly abandon in the moments when effort is required, and no one would ever know the difference. Most people have never explicitly set a daily standard. They have vague aspirations. Of course, they have goals and intentions and things they would like to achieve, but they have never sat down and defined, with precision and commitment, what their minimum acceptable day looks like. What is the floor of performance below which they will not allow themselves to fall? Not because of external accountability, but because of the internal standard they have committed to upholding, regardless of circumstances. Without that defined standard, the day is governed by default, by whatever feels manageable given the current level of energy or motivation, by whatever the environment makes easiest, by whatever seems like enough, in the absence of a clear benchmark. And enough, as we have already established, is one of the most dangerous words in the vocabulary of an unfulfilled potential. Setting a daily standard begins with honesty. Brutal, uncomfortable, deeply personal honesty about the gap between the level you are currently operating at and the level you are capable of. Most people, when they look at this gap honestly, recognize that it is not primarily a gap of talent or opportunity. It is a gap of standard. They have been living to a standard that is below their capability, accepting less from themselves than they could give, finishing the day consistently short of what was truly possible if they had brought everything they had. And because this shortfall has become normalized, because it has become the expected baseline, it has stopped feeling like underperformance and started feeling simply like life. The daily standard breaks that normalization. It draws a line and says, below this, I do not go. Not today, not when I am tired, not when I am frustrated, not when the motivation is absent and the resistance is high, and the easier option is calling with everything it has. Below this standard, I do not go. Because the standard is not something I do when conditions are favorable. It is something I am. What does a daily standard actually look like in practice? It is specific, not vague. It is not, I will try to be productive today. It is, I will do 2 hours of deep, uninterrupted work on my most important project before I look at any other demand on my attention. It is not, I will take care of my health. It is, I will move my body for at least 30 minutes every day, regardless of what else is happening. It is not, I will try to keep learning. It is, I will consume one piece of genuinely challenging material every single day and spend 5 minutes connecting it to something I am already working on. The specificity is not bureaucratic. It is protective. It protects the standard from the infinite rationalizations that the comfort-seeking brain will generate every time the standard becomes inconvenient. A vague standard can always be satisfied by a vague effort. A specific standard requires a specific performance, and the specificity removes the negotiation, the compromising, the just this once that slowly erodes every standard that has not been defined with enough precision to be defended. There is also a compounding effect to the daily standard that is worth understanding clearly. Every day that you meet your standard, no matter how difficult it was to do so. You are building something, not just completing a task or hitting a metric. You are building evidence. Evidence that you are someone who does what they said they would do. Evidence that the standard is real, not aspirational. Evidence that when circumstances are difficult and motivation is low, you still show up at the level you committed to. And this evidence accumulates into something deeply powerful, which is self-trust, the knowledge, grounded in lived experience rather than hope, that you can be counted on by others, yes, but more importantly, by yourself. Self-trust is one of the rarest and most valuable assets a human being can possess, and it is built entirely through the repeated experience of keeping the promises you make to yourself. Every time you honor your standard, you make a deposit into that account. Every time you abandon it, you make a withdrawal. And the balance of that account, positive or negative, has an enormous influence on the quality of your ambitions, the boldness of your actions, and the depth of your belief in your own ability to follow through on what matters most. One of the most important dimensions of the daily standard is how you respond to the days when you fall short. Because you will fall short. Not often, if the standard is well set and the commitment is genuine, but occasionally, inevitably, you will miss. The question is, what happens next? Do you use the miss as evidence that the standard was unrealistic, quietly lowering it to a level that is more comfortable? Do you spiral into self-recrimination that consumes the energy needed to perform better the next day? Or do you acknowledge it clearly without excessive drama or self-criticism, understand what caused it, and recommit to the standard immediately and without negotiation? The highest performers in every field have a specific relationship with their own failures that sets them apart. They do not catastrophize. They do not excuse. They analyze and they return. The standard does not change because one day was difficult. If anything, the difficulty of that day becomes fuel for the next one. Because the daily standard is not about perfection. It is about the pattern. And a pattern of meeting a high standard consistently, interrupted occasionally by honest human limitation but never abandoned, is the pattern of a life lived at full potential. Hold the standard every day, especially on the days when you do not want to, especially on the days when no one is watching and no one would know the difference. Because those are precisely the days that define who you actually are, as opposed to who you intend to be. And the person you actually are, on those quiet, difficult, unwatched days, is the person whose potential you will ultimately live. Chapter 11. Breaking Old Patterns. Every person reading this has at least one pattern they have tried to break and failed. A pattern of procrastination. A pattern of self-sabotage at the moment of greatest opportunity. A pattern of beginning strong and fading. A pattern of seeking comfort when what the moment demands is courage. A pattern of choosing the short-term relief over the long-term result. Again and again, despite knowing exactly what they are doing and exactly what it is costing them. These patterns are not character flaws. They are not evidence of weakness or moral failure. They are the deeply grooved neural pathways of a brain that has learned, over years and sometimes decades, that a particular response to a particular trigger produces a particular kind of relief. And the brain, being above all else an efficiency-seeking organ, runs that pattern automatically, without consultation, without deliberation, often without the conscious mind even noticing what has happened until it is already done. Understanding this is the beginning of genuine change. Not self-forgiveness as an excuse to continue, but self-understanding as a foundation for effective intervention. Because you cannot disrupt a pattern you do not fully understand. And most people are attempting to break patterns at the behavioral level without ever examining the architecture that underlies them. Every automatic pattern in human behavior follows a structure. There is a trigger, the specific cue that initiates the sequence. There is a routine, the automatic response that the trigger sets in motion. And there is a reward, the payoff that the brain receives for running the pattern. The reason the pattern was encoded in the first place, and the reason it persists. The trigger might be a feeling of overwhelm that automatically initiates a routine of distraction, which delivers the reward of temporary relief from the discomfort of the difficult task. The trigger might be a moment of social comparison that initiates a routine of self-criticism, which delivers the perverse reward of lowered expectations that protect against the pain of future disappointment. The trigger might be the end of a hard week that initiates the routine of abandoning the discipline that the rest of the week maintained, delivering the reward of a feeling of freedom that is actually a surrender of progress. The key insight is this: the reward is always real. The brain is not running patterns for no reason. Every automatic behavior that you want to change is serving a function, meeting a need, delivering something that the brain has decided it requires. And trying to eliminate the pattern without understanding and addressing the underlying need is why most attempts at change fail. You suppress the behavior temporarily through willpower, but the underlying need remains unmet. The trigger still fires, the urge still rises, and eventually, when willpower is depleted, the pattern reasserts itself with the accumulated force of everything that was suppressed. Effective pattern disruption does not try to eliminate the pattern through force. It seeks to understand the need the pattern is meeting and to find a new, more constructive routine that meets the same need. The person who reaches for distraction when overwhelmed does not need to stop reaching for relief. They need a different form of relief, one that does not cost them the progress they are trying to make. A brief walk, a few minutes of deliberate breathing, a short physical reset that genuinely addresses the stress response rather than merely masking it with stimulation. When the new routine can deliver a comparable reward to the old one, the brain can be gradually retrained to prefer it. Not immediately, not without resistance, but consistently over time with patience and deliberate repetition. There is also a critical role that awareness plays in pattern disruption that is worth examining in depth. Most patterns operate in what psychologists call the automatic processing system, the part of the brain that runs fast, effortless, and largely unconscious. The moment of breaking a pattern is the moment you can insert conscious deliberation between the trigger and the routine. That gap, however small, is where change lives. The person who becomes aware in real time that they have just been triggered, who can observe the urge rising without immediately acting on it, who can pause for even a few seconds in that space between stimulus and response, has fundamentally different options available to them than the person who is running on pure autopilot. Building this awareness is not complicated, but it is demanding. It requires the practice of catching yourself at the moment of trigger rather than after the pattern has already run. This is a skill, and like all skills, it develops through deliberate practice. One of the most effective methods is to identify in advance the specific triggers that initiate the pattern you are trying to break. The specific situations, emotional states, times of day, or environmental cues that reliably precede the unwanted behavior. Once identified, you can create what might be called an implementation intention, a specific, pre-decided plan for what you will do instead when you encounter that trigger. The plan does not need to be elaborate. It simply needs to exist before the trigger occurs, so that when the trigger fires, the new response is available as a default, rather than something you have to generate from scratch under pressure. There is a phenomenon in the psychology of change called the fresh start effect, and it is worth deploying strategically. Research has shown that people are significantly more likely to pursue behavioral change following temporal landmarks. Mondays, the first of the month, birthdays, New Year's. These landmarks create a psychological separation between the old self and the new one, a mental line that makes it easier to leave the previous pattern on the other side and begin fresh. You can create your own fresh starts deliberately. A new environment, a new routine structure, a symbolic gesture that marks the beginning of the new chapter. The brain responds to these markers. Use them intentionally. Perhaps the most underappreciated dimension of breaking old patterns is the role of identity, which we have already examined in depth. A pattern is not just a behavior. It is a story about who you are. When you repeatedly run a pattern of avoidance, you are not just avoiding the task. You are reinforcing the narrative that you are someone who avoids. When you repeatedly run a pattern of giving up when things get hard, you are not just quitting in that moment. You are accumulating evidence for the identity of someone who does not finish things. And that identity, once established, becomes one of the most powerful drivers of continued pattern repetition, because people act in accordance with their story about themselves, even when that story is working against them. This is why pattern disruption that is paired with an identity shift is exponentially more effective than pattern disruption attempted in isolation. When you can say, not just I am trying to stop doing this, but I am becoming someone who does not do this, the motivation to break the pattern becomes intrinsic rather than purely effortful. The pattern is no longer just inconvenient. It is out of character. And the human desire to be consistent with one's own identity is a far more durable force than willpower. You are not your patterns. Your patterns are simply the learned responses of a brain doing its best to meet its needs efficiently given the information and experiences it has accumulated. But the brain is plastic. It learns. It rewires. And every time you interrupt a pattern and choose a different response, you are literally reshaping the neural architecture that underlies your behavior. The groove of the old pattern grows shallower with each interruption. The groove of the new response grows deeper with each repetition. And gradually, through consistent practice over time, what was once effortful becomes automatic. What was once the exception becomes the norm. And the person who used to struggle against their own patterns becomes someone who has genuinely outgrown them. That is not just behavioral change. That is transformation. And it is available to you beginning with the very next trigger. if you choose to meet it differently than you have before. Chapter 12. The Momentum Principle. There is a physics concept that maps almost perfectly onto the psychology of human achievement, and understanding it will change how you approach every significant goal you pursue. The concept is inertia. An object at rest tends to stay at rest. An object in motion tends to stay in motion. The force required to set a stationary object moving is dramatically greater than the force required to keep a moving object moving. And this principle, which Newton formulated to describe the behavior of physical objects, describes the behavior of human beings pursuing their potential with an accuracy that is almost unsettling. Getting started is the hardest part, not because starting requires the most skill or the most effort in any absolute sense, but because the psychological resistance to initiating a significant new behavior, the inertia of the resting state, is enormous. When you are not yet in motion towards something meaningful, the gap between where you are and where you want to be can feel so large that starting feels almost pointless. The cognitive load of figuring out where to begin, combined with the emotional weight of uncertainty about whether the effort will produce the desired result, combined with the comfort of the current state, creates a barrier that stops most people before they take a single step. But here is what they never tell you about that barrier. It is at its highest at the very beginning, and once you break through it, even imperfectly, even partially, the dynamics shift dramatically. Movement creates momentum, and momentum, once established, has a self-sustaining quality that transforms the experience of working toward a goal from an exhausting uphill battle into something closer to a current that carries you. This is why the advice to start before you are ready is not just philosophical encouragement. It is a practical strategy for bypassing the highest point of resistance and accessing the momentum that only movement can create. The writer who waits until inspiration arrives before beginning will wait indefinitely. The writer who begins before inspiration arrives, who starts the work in a state of flatness and uncertainty, very often finds that the act of writing generates the inspiration that waiting never could. The entrepreneur who waits until every aspect of the plan is perfect before launching will find the launch perpetually deferred. The one who begins with an imperfect version and iterates in response to real-world feedback will find momentum building from the first imperfect step. Motion activates capability in ways that stillness cannot. The mind that is actively engaged with a problem sees possibilities and connections that the idle mind misses. The person in motion makes decisions faster because they have the feedback of real experience to inform their choices rather than the uncertainty of pure speculation. They develop skills faster because they are practicing rather than preparing to practice. They build confidence faster because confidence is not a precondition for action but a consequence of it, the byproduct of accumulated evidence that you can do what you are trying to do. All of these benefits are inaccessible until you begin, and the longer you delay beginning, the longer you remain locked out of them. The momentum principle has specific implications for how you structure your approach to any significant goal. One of the most important is what might be called the 2-minute rule, applied not to maintenance of existing habits, but to the initiation of new ones. The rule is deceptively simple. If a new behavior feels overwhelming to begin, reduce the starting requirement to something so small that resistance becomes almost illogical. You do not need to write the entire chapter. You need to write the first paragraph. You do not need to complete the full workout. You need to put on your shoes and walk to the starting point. You do not need to fully solve the difficult problem. You need to spend 2 minutes looking at it. The purpose of this reduction is not to perpetuate small effort. It is to break through the initiation resistance and establish the state of motion, at which point continuing becomes dramatically easier than stopping. There is also a compounding dimension to momentum that operates over longer time frames and deserves explicit attention. In the early stages of any meaningful pursuit, progress is often invisible. The improvements are too small to see. The results are too modest to celebrate. The gap between where you are and where you want to be is still so large that it is easy to conclude that the effort is not working. This is the phase where most people stop, not because they have failed in any meaningful sense, but because the momentum has not yet become visible, and without visible momentum, the motivation to continue erodes. What they do not know, because they stop before it arrives, is that progress in almost every domain of human development follows a non-linear curve. In the early stages, effort is high and visible progress is low. But beneath the surface, the foundations are being laid. The skills are developing. The neural pathways are forming. The habits are beginning to solidify. The knowledge is beginning to compound. And then, after a period of apparently slow progress that varies in length but almost always feels longer than it should, something shifts. The curve begins to steepen. Results accelerate. The same level of effort that previously produced modest returns begins producing exponential ones, because the investment of the early phase, the unseen, unrewarded, easily abandoned early phase, has finally reached the threshold at which it begins to compound visibly. This is why consistency through the early phase is so critical, and why quitting during it is so catastrophically costly. The people who ultimately achieve extraordinary things are very often not dramatically more talented or more intelligent than those who do not. They are the ones who pushed through the period of invisible progress with enough consistency to reach the inflection point where their accumulated effort began to compound into visible results. And once that threshold is crossed, momentum becomes almost self-sustaining. The results reinforce the effort. The evidence of progress replenishes the motivation to continue. The identity of someone who achieves things becomes more and more solidly established with each piece of evidence that accumulates. Protect your momentum fiercely. Understand that breaks in momentum, while sometimes necessary and sometimes healthy, always carry a cost. The cost of rebuilding what was lost. The cost of re-establishing the neural grooves that were just beginning to deepen. The cost of refighting the initiation resistance that had just been overcome. This does not mean you cannot rest. Rest is not the enemy of momentum. Collapse is. The difference between the two is intention. A planned recovery period, structured to restore energy and capacity, is part of an intelligent performance system. An unplanned abandonment of the work because the motivation temporarily dipped is a momentum killer. And the person who cannot distinguish between the two will find themselves perpetually rebuilding from zero, never accumulating the compounding advantages of sustained forward motion. Use momentum as a lens for every decision that relates to your most important pursuits. Ask not just, what is the right thing to do right now, but what is the decision that best protects and builds the momentum I have accumulated. That lens will not always point toward the most immediately comfortable option, but it will consistently point toward the one that moves you closer to the life you are capable of living. Chapter 13. The Point of No Return. There is a moment in every genuine transformation where something fundamental changes. Not the moment of first commitment, which is important but fragile. Not the moment of first visible progress, which is encouraging but still reversible. But a deeper, more permanent shift. A moment where the old version of yourself no longer feels like an option you could return to, even if you wanted to. Where the identity of who you are becoming has taken root deeply enough that reverting would require active effort rather than passive surrender. Where the direction of your life has been irreversibly pointed towards something greater than what you were before. This is the point of no return. And understanding how to reach it, how to deliberately push yourself across the threshold from which going back becomes harder than going forward, is one of the most powerful strategic advantages a person can cultivate. Most people never reach it, not because they lack the desire for transformation, but because they stop at the level of commitment and never push through to the level of irreversibility. They make the decision. They begin the work. They experience some initial success. And then, at the first significant obstacle or the first period of sustained difficulty, they encounter the option to retreat. And because the transformation has not yet crossed the threshold of irreversibility, because the old self is still fully available as a destination, retreating feels like a viable response, like a reasonable adjustment rather than the abandonment it actually is. And they take it. And the transformation that was building, that was genuinely close to crossing the threshold into permanence, dissolves back into the pattern of starting and stopping that has defined the relationship between potential and reality for as long as they can remember. The point of no return is not a geographic location or a specific measurable achievement. It is a psychological state, and it is reached through the combination of several specific factors that, taken together, create the conditions for irreversible change. The first is public commitment. There is a principle in social psychology called consistency theory. Human beings have a deep need to appear consistent with their publicly stated positions. When you declare something to others, the social pressure to follow through on that declaration becomes a significant force in your behavior. This is why public commitments, genuine ones made to people whose opinion matters to you, are dramatically more durable than private intentions. When you tell no one about the change you intend to make, retreating from it carries no social cost. When you have made your intention visible to people who are now tracking your progress, retreating means confronting not just your own disappointment, but the visible evidence of inconsistency that others will observe. Most people work hard to avoid that evidence. Use that psychology deliberately by making your most important commitments visible. The second factor is what might be called burning the boats. This phrase comes from the historical tactic of military commanders who, upon landing on hostile shores, would order the fleet destroyed so that retreat became literally impossible. The psychological effect on troops who knew there was no way back was to focus every available resource on the only option remaining, which was to advance. In the context of personal transformation, Burning the boats means making commitments or investments that make reverting to the old path genuinely costly in concrete, practical terms. Signing up for the course and paying for it. Publicly announcing the launch date. Resigning from the position that was safe but limiting. Moving to the city where the opportunity exists. These decisions do not guarantee success, but they change the psychological calculus of persistence versus retreat in ways that purely internal commitment never can. Because now, quitting is not just the abandonment of an aspiration, it is the acceptance of a concrete loss. And the human aversion to concrete loss is one of the most powerful motivators of continued action that exists. The third factor is identity convergence. We have already explored the role of identity in depth. But in the context of reaching the point of no return, there is a specific threshold of identity convergence that matters enormously. It is the threshold at which the new identity becomes dominant over the old one, where being the person you are becoming starts to feel more natural, more true, more authentically you, than being the person you used to be. Before this threshold, the old identity is still the center of gravity and change is pulling against it. After this threshold, the new identity is the center of gravity and reverting would require pulling against it. The crossing of this threshold, this moment when the new self outweighs the old one in the balance of who you feel you actually are, is the psychological heart of the point of no return. Reaching this threshold faster requires the strategies we have already discussed. Consistent identity, consistent behavior, deliberate casting of votes for the new self, environmental design that reinforces the new identity, social environment that reflects and expects it. But it also requires something more direct. It requires actively and deliberately inhabiting the new identity, rather than trying it on tentatively. Not presenting yourself as someone who is trying to change, but as someone who has changed and is continuing to deepen that change. The distinction matters. Trying on an identity keeps it external, temporary, provisional. Inhabiting it makes it yours. The fourth factor in reaching the point of no return is the accumulation of wins that are meaningful enough to make the new path feel genuinely superior to the old one. Not just abstractly better in the long run, but concretely, experientially better in ways you can feel. The workout that produces a clarity and energy you would not trade for the comfort of skipping it. The creative work that generates a deep satisfaction no passive entertainment could match. The difficult conversation that, once navigated, produces a quality of relationship that the comfortable avoidance never could have. Each of these concrete experiences of the superiority of the new path over the old one is a brick in the foundation of irreversibility. They give your brain direct sensory and emotional evidence that the new way of living is not just more disciplined, but actually more rewarding. And the brain, which ultimately follows reward, begins to prefer the new path, not because you are forcing it to, but because the evidence of experience supports the preference. When you reach the point of no return, something remarkable happens to the quality of your effort. The constant battle between the old self and the new one quiets. The energy that was being consumed by the internal conflict of wanting to change while also wanting to stay the same becomes available for actual progress. You stop fighting yourself, and the momentum that was partially offset by internal resistance begins to compound without that drag. Progress accelerates. The work deepens. The life you are building begins to feel not like a destination you are struggling toward, but like the natural expression of who you have become. Push for it. Deliberately, strategically, with every tool available to you. Because on the other side of that threshold, everything is different. Not because the challenges disappear, they do not, but because you are meeting them as a fundamentally different person. One who has already decided, at a level deeper than conscious intention, that there is no going back. And from that position, going forward is not just the right choice, it is the only one that still makes sense. Chapter 14. When it gets hard. Everything in this audiobook up to this point has been about building the understanding, the systems, the identity, and the momentum required to close the gap between who you are and who you are capable of becoming. And if you have been genuinely engaged with these ideas, something in you has been activated. A sense of possibility, a clarity about what needs to change and what needs to be built, a level of motivation and resolve that feels real and solid and sufficient for the journey ahead. And then life will happen, and it will get hard. Not hypothetically, not as a possibility to consider. Certainly, inevitably, without question, the path toward your potential will include periods of genuine difficulty that no amount of preparation, no quality of system, no depth of identity shift can make easy. There will be days when the motivation is genuinely absent, not just low but gone, when the work feels meaningless, and the gap between where you are and where you want to be seems not to be closing but widening. There will be setbacks that are not just inconvenient but genuinely costly. Losses that hurt in ways you did not anticipate. Failures that challenge not just your strategies but your belief in the entire direction you have chosen. There will be people who doubt you, not because they are cruel, but because your growth confronts them with their own stagnation. There will be moments when every rational argument for continuing seems less compelling than the single, very human desire to stop. This chapter is for those moments. Not before them, for them. Because the quality of your response in the hardest moments of the journey will determine more about the ultimate outcome of your life than any other single variable. And most people, even those who have prepared extensively, have not prepared specifically for the experience of genuine difficulty. They have prepared for the work. They have not fully prepared for the dark. The first thing to understand about hard moments is that they are not evidence that something has gone wrong. They are evidence that you are in the right place. Difficulty is the inevitable companion of meaningful pursuit. The absence of difficulty does not mean you are on an easier path to the same destination. It almost certainly means you are on a different, smaller path to a smaller destination. The most significant things any human being has ever achieved were achieved in the face of difficulty that regularly threatened to end the pursuit. Not as a romantic narrative about suffering being necessary, but as a simple factual observation about the nature of significant achievement. If it were easy, everyone would do it. The difficulty is precisely what creates the space for someone willing to endure it to achieve something that most people will not. This reframing is not just motivational, it is cognitively useful. When you encounter difficulty and interpret it as a sign that you are wrong, that you made a mistake in committing to this path, that the reasonable response is to reconsider, you are interpreting a signal of progress as a signal of error. And that misinterpretation leads to the abandonment of exactly the pursuits that, continued through the difficulty, would have produced the greatest results. when you can reframe difficulty as confirmation that you are engaging with something real and significant, the difficulty does not disappear, but your relationship to it changes. It stops being a reason to stop and becomes evidence that continuing matters. The second thing to understand is that motivation is not a reliable guide in hard moments. Not because motivation is unimportant, but because it is cyclical. It rises and falls based on factors that have nothing to do with the validity or importance of what you are pursuing. Energy levels, sleep, nutrition, social interactions, minor failures, the weather, the accumulated psychological weight of a difficult week. All of these affect motivation. And a strategy that requires high motivation to function will fail whenever any of these factors depresses it, which is often. This is why everything we have built throughout this audiobook, the non-negotiables, the daily standard, the systems, the identity, has been designed to operate independently of motivation, to be the structure that holds when the feeling of motivation is absent. Because systems are reliable in a way that feelings are not. And the person who has built their practice on systems rather than motivation will continue through the hard periods that stop everyone else. On the days when nothing feels right, when the work is grinding and the results are invisible and the motivation is gone, the question to ask is not whether you feel like continuing. You do not. The question is whether you are someone who continues anyway. And the answer to that question, repeated across the hard days over months and years, is the answer to the question of whether you reach your potential. There is a specific kind of hard that deserves particular attention, and it is the hard that comes with failure, not the small, frequent failures that are simply part of learning and growth, but the significant failures, the ones that cost real time, real resources, real relationships, the ones that generate not just disappointment, but genuine grief. These failures, if not handled well, have the power to do permanent damage to the pursuit of potential. Not because the failure itself is necessarily that costly, but because of the narrative that forms around it. The story the mind begins to tell about what the failure means, about whether it confirms the fears that were present from the beginning, about whether it is evidence that this path was never really right, about whether continuing is wisdom or simply the stubborn refusal to accept an obvious truth. The most important thing you can do in the immediate aftermath of a significant failure is to resist the urge to interpret it permanently, to hold the narrative loosely, to allow the initial emotional response, the disappointment, the frustration, the grief, to move through without immediately coding it into a fixed story about yourself or your future. Emotions are real and they deserve to be experienced, not suppressed. But they are temporary, and they are unreliable narrators of permanent truth. The story about what the failure means is best written not in the immediate aftermath, but after enough time has passed that the emotional charge has subsided and perspective has returned. When that perspective returns, the question to ask of any failure is not what does this say about my potential, but what does this teach me about the path? What was missing? What was wrong about the assumption? What would need to be different for the next attempt to produce a different result? These are questions that treat failure as information rather than verdict. And information, regardless of how painful its delivery, is one of the most valuable inputs available to someone engaged in the pursuit of anything significant. There is also the dimension of self-compassion in hard times that needs to be addressed carefully. There is a version of self-compassion that is actually a form of self-sabotage. The version that says you have been through enough, that you deserve a break from the standards you set, that the difficult moment justifies a temporary return to lesser behavior. This version, while emotionally appealing, is the voice of the comfort trap dressed in the language of self-care. And learning to distinguish it from genuine self-compassion is a critical skill. Genuine self-compassion in hard moments does not lower the standard. It acknowledges the difficulty of meeting it. It says, this is genuinely hard, and it is reasonable to find it hard. And the fact that it is hard does not make you weak. It then says, and you are still going to do it. Because who you are becoming does not use difficulty as a reason to shrink. Genuine self-compassion is the voice of a demanding coach who believes deeply in your capability. It holds you to a high standard precisely because it sees what you are capable of and refuses to accept less from you, even when, especially when, you are tempted to accept less from yourself. When it gets hard, return to your reasons. Not the surface reasons, the goals and outcomes and metrics of success, but the deep reasons, the ones that live below the level of ambition and connect to something more fundamental about who you are and what you believe your life is for. The reasons that, when you access them fully and honestly, make continuing feel not just strategic but necessary, not just useful but true. Those reasons are your anchor in the storms that will come. They are what hold you to the path when every other force is pulling you off it. And here is the final truth about the hard periods. They end, not because life gets easier, but because you get stronger. The person who comes through a genuinely hard period intact, who maintained their standard and their momentum through the darkness, is not the same person who entered it. They are more capable, more resilient, more deeply convinced of their own ability to endure what needs to be endured, in service of what matters most. The hard period that felt like it was trying to end the journey was actually forging the character that makes the journey possible. And on the other side of it, the person you find yourself to be will be someone you respect at a level that the comfortable version of yourself never could have earned. Chapter 15. The life you were meant to live. You have come a long way in this audiobook. You have looked honestly at the forces that work against human potential. The comfort trap, the silent killers, the inherited lies, the fear of becoming. You have built understanding of the structures that support genuine growth. The identity shift, the environmental design, the social environment, the execution blueprint, the daily standard. You have examined how to break old patterns, how to build and protect momentum, how to reach the point of irreversibility, and how to continue when the journey gets genuinely hard. And now, in this final chapter, we arrive at the question that underlies all of the others. The question that gives everything else its meaning and its urgency. What is the life you were meant to live? Not the life you were assigned by your circumstances. Not the life that your environment made easy or your social group made normal. Not the life that fits safely within the expectations of the people around you or the limitations of the version of yourself you have been living as until now. But the life that is available to you when you remove every artificial ceiling, when you take your full capability seriously, when you commit with everything you have to the ongoing, demanding, profoundly rewarding practice of becoming. This is not a question with a fixed answer. The life you are meant to live is not a single predetermined destination waiting to be discovered, like a treasure buried somewhere in your future. It is a direction, a continuous expansion of what you are capable of contributing, experiencing, and becoming. It is a life in which the gap between who you are and who you could be is not a source of quiet despair, but a source of active, energized purpose. A gap not to be ashamed of, but to be worked at, deliberately, joyfully, with the full engagement of everything you are. But there is something important to address before we go further, because the question of the life you were meant to live can easily become another form of waiting, another version of someday. I will start fully living when I have figured out my purpose, when I have discovered my calling, when I have found the thing that makes it all clear and inevitable and easy. And this version of the question is just as paralyzing as the other traps we have examined, because it makes full engagement conditional on a clarity that almost never arrives before the engagement begins. The truth about purpose, one of the most consistently misunderstood concepts in the entire domain of personal development, is that it is almost never found. It is built. It is the emergent quality of a life engaged fully and honestly with the things that matter, pursued with commitment and skill and genuine contribution over time. The people who seem to have found their calling did not typically discover it in a moment of divine revelation. They developed it through years of engaged effort, through the gradual refinement of what they cared about and what they were becoming capable of, through the compounding of small, meaningful choices into a life that eventually felt coherent and deeply theirs. Purpose is not a thing you find. It is a thing you build. And you build it by starting, imperfectly, with what you currently care about and what you are currently capable of, and allowing it to develop through the process of doing. The life you were meant to live begins, therefore, not with perfect clarity, but with imperfect commitment, with the decision to stop drifting and start directing, to stop waiting for the ideal conditions and start building the life you want from the conditions you have, to stop living as though the best of yourself is something that belongs to the future, and to begin right now, in this specific and unrepeatable moment, to become it. What does that actually look like? In the most practical terms, it looks like a life organized around growth rather than comfort. Not a life without comfort or pleasure or rest, but a life in which those things serve the ongoing project of becoming rather than replace it. A life in which the default response to a challenge is not, how do I avoid this, but what can I learn from engaging with this? A life in which the measure of a good day is not how comfortable it was, but how fully you showed up for what mattered in it. It looks like a life of genuine contribution. One of the most consistent findings in the research on human fulfillment is that the deepest and most durable sense of meaning comes not from achievement for its own sake, but from achievement that serves something beyond the self. The skill that becomes a service, the discipline that enables a contribution, the growth that makes you more capable of being genuinely useful to the people and the communities and the purposes that matter to you. The most fully realized human beings are almost invariably people whose personal development and their contribution to others are deeply intertwined, each one feeding the other in a cycle that makes both more meaningful. It looks like a life of deep and honest relationships, the kind that are only possible when you have done enough of your own inner work to show up without the defensive armor of an unexamined ego. When you are secure enough in who you are to be genuinely curious about who others are, when you have enough self-knowledge to distinguish between what you actually feel and what you habitually perform. The quality of your relationships is, in many ways, the most direct measure of the quality of your inner development. And a life in which you are growing relationally, deepening your capacity for genuine connection, honesty, and love, is a life that is rich in ways that external achievement alone can never produce. It looks like a life in which you are not the same person next year that you are today. Not because today's person is inadequate or flawed in some essential way, but because growth is not just a strategy. It is an expression of aliveness. The tree that is not growing is dying. The human being who has stopped growing, who has declared themselves finished, who has settled into the comfortable assumption that they have already become who they are going to be, is living at a fraction of what their existence was built to contain. There is a question that has been asked, in various forms, by philosophers and psychologists and ordinary people confronting their own mortality across centuries and cultures. The question of what you would regret not having done. Not the failures, not the attempts that did not work out. Almost nobody, looking back on a life well lived, regrets the risks they took that did not pay off. What they regret is the unlived life, the path not taken because it was too uncertain, the version of themselves they never became because becoming it required more than they were willing to risk, the contributions they did not make because making them would have required more courage, more commitment, more willingness to be seen and judged and possibly found wanting than they were able to summon. You are not at the end of your life. You are at a point in it where the choices you make from here will determine what you look back on. And the single most important choice you face, not once but daily, is whether you are going to live at the level of your potential or below it. Whether you are going to be the person who engaged fully with everything they were given, who stretched and risked and built and contributed at the highest level they were capable of, or the person who was waiting for better conditions, more certainty, more readiness, more time. You know which one you want to be. You have always known. That is why you are here. That is why you listen to every word of this audiobook. Because something in you recognized that the life you are currently living, while it may be good, is not yet the fullest expression of what you are capable of. And something in you is not willing to accept that gap as permanent. Honor that something. That inner insistence on more is not arrogance, and it is not ingratitude for what you already have. It is the most accurate and honest signal your deepest self can send. It is the voice of your potential, persistent and patient, calling you toward the version of your life that is still waiting to be built. Everything you have learned in this audiobook is now in your hands. The understanding of why most people stop short and the exact mechanisms that keep them there. The tools for shifting your identity, designing your environment, executing with precision, holding your standard, building momentum, breaking through to irreversibility, and continuing through difficulty. These are not theoretical concepts. They are practical instruments for the construction of a different kind of life. But instruments are only as useful as the hands that use them. And the hands that will use them, or not, are yours. So, here is the final and most important question this audiobook can leave you with. Not, what have you learned? But, what will you do with what you have learned? Starting not tomorrow, not when things settle down, not when you feel more ready. Starting today, with whatever small, specific, concrete action is most aligned with the person you are committed to becoming. One action today, and then another tomorrow, and then another the day after that, until the accumulation of those actions has built something you could not have imagined from where you currently stand. The life you were meant to live is not somewhere out there waiting for you to be lucky enough to find it. It is something you build deliberately and daily from the materials of who you are and the commitment to become more. It is the work of a lifetime, pursued with everything you have, given freely and fully to the world in the form of your best self. Go build it, starting now. There is one more thing that needs to be said before this audiobook ends, and it is this. The journey toward your potential is not a solo endeavor, even when it feels like one. Every person who has ever built something meaningful, every person who has ever crossed the threshold from ordinary to extraordinary, has done so while being shaped by others, by the thinkers whose words they absorbed, by the examples they chose to follow, by the teachers, mentors, and challengers who held a mirror up to their blind spots and a lantern up to their path. You are already in that tradition. The fact that you are here, that you spent this time engaging seriously with these ideas, rather than choosing one of the infinite, easier alternatives available to you, says something about who you are and who you intend to become. Now let that intention become action. Let the understanding you have built here become the foundation for choices that are different from the ones that produced the life you currently have. Let the identity you have been invited to step into become not just an aspiration but a daily practice. Let the standard you have heard described become the one you hold yourself to, privately, consistently, without negotiation, as the minimum expression of respect you owe to the version of yourself that is waiting on the other side of your full commitment. The potential you carry is not something you earned or were given. It is something you are responsible for, and the highest form of that responsibility is to take it seriously, completely, without reservation, without the comfortable excuses of timing or circumstance or readiness. To say, clearly and finally, that the unlived version of this life is not acceptable to you, that the gap between who you are and who you could be is not a permanent condition, but a temporary distance that you are actively, deliberately, and irreversibly closing. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one version of yourself at a time. That is the work. It is the most important work you will ever do. And it starts now.